The Tuesday of Easter week. I hope you're enjoying your Easter, even if you are locked in at home. You know, I'm glad to be British for all sorts of reasons. In spite of everything we say about it, one reason is connected with our climate. There's nothing in the world quite like springtime in the United Kingdom, although I know we haven't seen much of it yet this year. But I'm so thankful that in Britain, Easter always comes to us in the spring. So it is natural and surely providential that we should see in this reawakening of nature to life all around us a sort of parable of the resurrection. Yet the truth itself is far greater than these reflections of it. For in nature, the new life is all too short lived and fades again almost as quickly as it blossoms. That is why nature, in all the freshness of her beauty, still cannot adequately tell of him whose day is followed by no night, whose spring will never have to endure another winter. For Christ, being raised from the dead, dieth no more. Death has no more dominion over him. His triumph over death is final and complete. It can never be reversed. I am he that liveth and was dead, he says to us, and behold, I am alive for evermore. So the gospel we preach is the gospel of the resurrection. And if the resurrection had never happened, there would be nothing to preach. If the gospel story had ended on Good Friday, it would have been just one more tale of martyrdom for the truth, nobly accepted and heroically borne. But it would not have given us any reason whatever to hope that truth and goodness would ultimately prevail. The conclusion which we should have been forced to draw would rather have been that God, if there were a God, was utterly uncaring and callous. A young man who had led the ideally good life had been publicly condemned and executed, and that Friday night the silent stars looked down upon his grave in cold indifference. But then, 2 days later, before the sun rose on Sunday morning, the God of heaven and earth declared once and for all by an unmistakable sign that he was in Christ, reconciling the world unto himself. For God raised him from the dead and gave him glory. And that mighty act of God is the foundation of all our hopes. I think it's worth noticing that the New Testament writers don't normally speak of Christ rising from the dead, but of his being raised. They see the resurrection, that is to say, as something which God did. Something which God did. And the importance of that scriptural way of looking at it is that it guarantees for us the perfect righteousness of God. For the God who rules the universe is the God who raised up Jesus from the dead. And through that one forsaken grave, which, in Alice Meynell's words, this planet bears as chief treasure, God has given us an unconquerable hope which will govern all our thinking and all our living if we really truly believe it is true. And it is about that hope that I want to speak to you this morning. On Good Friday night, the world was as near to being without hope as it had ever been. And those who were later to be known as Christians were the most bewildered and disappointed of all people in the world that night. Their friend and leader was dead. The movement he had led had collapsed like a house of cards, and all their glowing hopes were shattered. You can tell how deep the disappointment and disillusionment of his 11 disciples was when you recall their great difficulty in believing that he had really risen from the dead when the news was first brought to them. The woman's report, St. Luke tells us, seemed to the apostles to be idle talk, and they didn't believe them. It was the same with the two sad-eyed disciples whom the risen Lord met on the road to Emmaus that evening. You remember how he had to rebuke them for their slowness of heart to believe? Never were men less in a mood to imagine that they had seen the risen Lord and then persuade themselves that it had really happened. But they were convinced because the accumulated evidence of their own eyes and hearts was overwhelming. When later that night the two disciples returned from Emmaus to Jerusalem, bursting with their news, they found the 11 already gathered together in the upper room and were greeted with the excited outburst, "The Lord is really risen, and he's appeared to Simon now." A few minutes later, there was a sudden stillness, and the risen Christ himself was in their midst again. No one had seen him come, but he was there. After that, there could be no more doubts. It was that certainty that Christ had risen from the dead which transformed them so dramatically from a group of frightened, disillusioned mourners to men of such courage and conviction that they turned the world upside down. The disappointment of Friday night had been changed into a radiant, unconquerable hope which nothing could undermine. And we share that hope. As I said yesterday, we're not merely spectators in this Easter drama. We're all taking part in it. The hope which transformed them is ready to transform us, and in practice, this hope is one of the qualities we need most of all in the actual living of the Christian life. Which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. That's from the letter to the Hebrews. Now, of course, hope in the ordinary sense of the word is much too unreliable a quality to offer us any sort of security. It's there one moment and gone the next, often with little rhyme or reason for its appearance or disappearance. It depends on all sorts of things which have no rational connection with it at all, like the weather and our health and our moods. Some people are naturally more hopeful and optimistic than others. Some temperaments are foolishly so. Even in the same person, hope varies from day to day. Some days we feel more hopeful than other days. But even in our most optimistic moods, there's always something uncertain and precarious about it. For example, if you say, "I hope it's going to be a bit warmer today than it was yesterday," it means you wouldn't like to take a bet on it. And if you say, "Well, we must hope for the best," it usually means that in your heart of hearts, you've already resigned yourself to the worst. But hope in the technical Christian sense, hope as the New Testament understands it, hope, the second of the great theological virtues, as they're called, that is to say, God-centered, God-given virtues. Hope in that sense means almost the exact opposite of that. It doesn't mean, "I hope, but I'm afraid it will almost certainly be otherwise." It doesn't even mean, "I hope, but I'm not quite sure." It means looking forward to the future with absolute confidence and assurance, because we know that it is all in the hands of Him whom we have learnt from the past to be able to trust completely. The God with whom we have to do is the God who raised up Jesus from the dead, so you can cast all your care on Him, for He careth for you. And you can be quite certain that in the end, as the old English writer says, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And that isn't wishful thinking. It's founded on the great solid fact of the sovereignty of Almighty God and the irrefutable evidence of that empty grave. God has demonstrated his power. He's proved his faithfulness to his word. He's shown us once and for all that though heaviness may endure for a night, and nights can sometimes be very long, maybe as this COVID-19 virus will be, joy will come in the morning. But we must remember that there is nothing limp or passive about this hope. Like faith and charity, it's rooted not in our feelings, in cooperation with it, but in our wills, and it requires an effort of our wills in cooperation with God's grace to exercise it. The Epistle to the Hebrews says that we have to lay hold of the hope set before us, like a drowning man laying hold of the lifeline that's thrown to him. And having laid hold of it, we have to retain our hold, and that is sometimes more difficult still. But we must beware, St. Paul warns us, of not being moved away from the hope of the gospel. Instead, we must hold fast our boldness and the glorying of our hope firm unto the end. Hold it fast, like a man holding fast to the raft, with every ounce of his strength, till he reaches safety. So it's no good complaining that we still don't feel very hopeful about the future. It isn't a question of our feelings, but of our wills. First of all, laying hold of this hope and then hanging on to it. And if you ask how hope can be rooted in our wills, how, even with the help of God's grace, you can make yourself hope, the answer is that it means continuing to act as if you hoped, even when hope has deserted you on the emotional level. Stoddart Kennedy, Woodbine Willie, once described faith as betting your life that there is a God. And hope, in the Christian sense, means betting your life that what reason and revelation tell you about him is true, and that he is a God who never fails us. I'm reminded of a passage in The Imitation of Christ by the mystic Thomas à Kempis. There was a man that was tossed ever to and fro between hope and despair. One day, overcome by sadness, he went into church and threw himself down in prayer before one of the altars. Ah, he thought, if only I could be sure that I shall persevere to the end. Whereupon he heard the divine answer in his heart. And if you were certain, what would you be doing? Do now what you would be doing then, and your anxieties will vanish. These anxieties won't vanish all at once, of course, but if you hold fast to your hope firm unto the end, you can be quite certain that for you too the promise will be fulfilled. But meanwhile, in practice, hope often means going on living as if we hoped, and it's only afterwards that we shall find that our hopes were justified. That is why hope and perseverance are so closely connected together and depend on each other. But we shall only go on hoping if we're prepared to persevere, and it's quite certain that we shall only persevere if we have a sure and certain hope that God can and will accomplish his purpose in us. And both qualities are the fruit of a living Easter faith. There was once a time when it could be said with truth that it looked as if the Christian religion had no future at all, and there were no grounds left to men for any hope. It is one of the great ironies of history that that time was the eve of the resurrection, and that day is past. and it can never return. Ever since then, the hope has been rooted in a solid, irrefutable fact, and so it has been the oldest and wisest counsellor of all, as the late Lord Halifax called it in the anxious days of 1940. For spring is here, a perfect, endless spring which shall never fade or fail before another winter. Easters come and go, but the Easter drama remains an eternal reality woven into the very fabric of creation. God give you grace to enter into it and play your own appointed part in it, so that, like the 11 apostles and the first Christians, you too may know the unending Easter of the heart. God bless you. Speak to you tomorrow.